I'm gonna start recording now. Yeah, your volleys, if that's what they're called, have been wonderful.
Thank you.
I hope to participate more there moving forward, but I have been able to listen. I saw Angus posted a short one about chapter 7 earlier today, asking us a question about Plato's cave and how we are to interpret turning toward the light in light of what Schelling, all the diamonds that Schelling and Hegel, as interpreted by Steiner, have to offer us. So I volunteered last week to lead us into this chapter because of my love for Schelling, though, as I often say when I lecture on these two, though I have this natural draw to Schelling. Every time I study Hegel again, I realize just how profound and important he is to balance some of the things that might be exaggerated in Schelling. So let me try to quickly lead us through here this chapter, which Steiner begins by describing Schelling's insight that, to philosophize about nature means to create nature. Steiner says that this is a flash of lightning illuminating the past and future path of philosophy. And in this statement, to philosophize about nature means to create nature, Schelling is, from Steiner's point of view, moving beyond Fichte, who he says lacked the power of imagination that allowed Schelling to gain this insight into the nature of nature and the way that our own creative thinking participates in the creative power of nature. There's a concept in this chapter that, at least in my edition, gets translated as intellectual, or gets translated as what was it? Intellectual imagination, I think. Is that what the translation was? Let me just verify that. Yeah, that's an odd translation of intellektuelle Anschauung in German. Forgive my pronunciation. Usually it's translated intellectual intuition, but I can see why the translator may have made this decision because it's such a dense concept coming out of Kant. And I wanted to just spend a minute to unpack that in light of a wonderful book by Eckhart Forster, The 25 Years of Philosophy, that deals with Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Goethe, and Hegel. Forster, if you're not familiar, is an anthroposophist, but also one of the foremost interpreters of German idealism. His anthroposophical leanings are somewhat covert. He does cite Steiner once in this text, but he's really moved the ball forward in German idealism studies by distinguishing Kant's use of intellectual intuition from his related notion, but different notion of intuitive understanding. And just to briefly summarize, Kant's position is really making definitive and quite stark this differentiation between the conceptual and the perceptual. For Kant, the two stems of human knowing are the understanding, which is discursive, and sensibility, which is passive. It's our experience of the forms of space and time that are just sort of given immediately without any activity on our part, right? Whereas the understanding, driven by the impulse toward unity of reason, which is kind of in the background, the understanding is active. It's our thinking. For Kant, these two are split, and so he only allows the human being to have a sensible intuition. There's no intellectual intuition in Kant. He forbids this because intellectual intuition would bring together the possibilities of our conceptual thought and the actualities of our sensible intuition in a way that for Kant only would be possible for God. or for a divine being, for whom thinking actually creates the object that is thought about in actuality. Then there's intuitive understanding, which Kant is borrowing from Spinoza. Actually, it's this what Spinoza called the third kind of knowing, which was very important for Goethe, where via intuitive understanding, one doesn't build up, say, an organism by analyzing its parts to arrive at a whole that would be merely the sum of the parts. Intuitive understanding grasps the wholeness of an organism immediately, right? And this is one way of understanding what Goethe is doing in his study of plant metamorphosis and even his color theory. And so all of this is to unpack this very dense concept, intellectual intuition, or what's translated as intellectual imagination in this chapter. Schelling bursts through the Kantian boundary between phenomena and things themselves to allow nature to think in him, as it were, so that his own creative thinking is understood to be the same power, realizing the same power by which organic nature gives birth to its forms. And so for Schelling, right, nature is to be visible spirit, spirit the invisible nature. There is a complex identity between nature and spirit in Schelling's thought. He views nature as not just a geometric system, but a life, a living process, an organism indeed, as his title on the world's soul, a text which Goethe liked very much, and that Schelling and Goethe discussed at great length in the late 1790s in Jena. Steiner gives this example from that text of gravity and the way that Schelling is able to reinterpret this issue that was vexing for mechanical philosophers, namely action at a distance. When we look using our eyes, our vision at the sun, it appears to be simply located far off in space, but we know through gravitational attraction that we can't simply say that the sun only acts where it is, or where it appears to be, at least. Its action, it is wherever it acts, is the way that Schelling articulates this. And so in a very real sense, we are, in that way, sun beings. We are inside the sun, and its action is working in us and on us all the time. Schelling articulates this philosophy of nature as a attempt to balance the transcendental orientation that Kant and Fichte developed. Schelling ends up wanting to maintain both of these positions, where the transcendental idealist is correct, that in some sense I produce nature, but there's a need to also recognize the way in which nature produces itself, which would be the perspective of the nature philosopher, that, as Schelling puts it, nature is a priori, right? Which is the counterpole to the Kantian position that would say mind is a priori. And Schelling's trying to have this sort of bivocal philosophy whereby the absolute can only be attained by fully working out both the transcendental and the natural philosophical perspectives to achieve a absolute identity that would be beyond either. I love this line where Schelling says, or Steiner says of Schelling, that he spun the facts of nature into an artful network of thought. All its phenomena stood as in an ideal, harmonious organism before his creative imagination. And this raises the question of the relationship between nature and art, which, again, to return to Kant in the Critique of Judgment, the first half of that text is about aesthetics and beauty, and the second half is about purpose in nature, organic nature in particular. And in that text, Kant describes artistic genius as this capacity to, as it were, tap into the unconscious productive power of nature so as to give rise to a work of art. And Kant is comfortable with this analogy between art and nature, but only to a certain extent, because he forbids scientific genius, which would similarly be able to tap into the productive power of nature so as to then consciously articulate in conceptual thought the nature of that productive power. Because Kant thought that a scientific genius, if they were like an artistic genius, wouldn't be able to explain in a discursive way how they came to that insight. The artistic genius creates unconsciously, as it were. Schelling, however, is claiming that scientific genius is possible. I think Goethe is a better exemplification of this type of genius, both for art and for science. But Schelling is articulating the missing philosophy for Goethe, justifying that this form of genius, scientific genius. And so again, Schelling's bringing us beyond Kant. But and I'll return to this with Schelling, or when we get to Hegel. I mean, there's a sense in which neither Schelling nor Hegel could achieve the type of maybe etheric imagination or clairvoyance that Steiner achieved. And so they're still, while they can dimly intimate that we do have the capacity as human beings to develop these new organs of perception, to see beyond the sensory veil, beyond the shadows on the cave wall, I don't think either of them really, at least fully develop this capacity in the way that Steiner does. And so they're giving us the conceptual superstructure, as it were, which assumes this is possible, but they don't actually exemplify it. Goethe gets a little bit closer, but he doesn't understand what he's doing well enough to articulate it, right? So, but there's a sense in which what Schelling is doing, and I'll turn to Hegel in a second, is a form of what one of my teachers and mentors and colleagues now, Brian Swim, the cosmologist, he calls it auto-cosmology. And so for Schelling, when he's trying to understand the history of nature or natural history, the evolution or development of the cosmos, culminating in the human being, it's a kind of anamnesis or recollection of the archetypal powers that inform historic nature. In theosophical terms, he's trying to read the Akashic record. And the human soul is, he'll say in one of his late unfinished texts, Ages of the World, Schelling will say that the human soul is created at the origin of things, and so is the usual translation is conscientious, which you could read as both conscious, but there's also this sense of conscience in there as well. I have to get out the book to get the German term, I forget, but the human soul is co-knowing with God, present at the creation, and so is capable now of recollecting the whole process in thought, right? And I think auto-cosmology is a nice way of rendering this procedure. Schelling inherits a lot from Spinoza, but he wants to see God not merely as a rational mind, but as a living personality. And as a result of this relationship to God as a living person, the creation, Schelling wants to see as, in some sense, also divine, but distinct from the creator, though in the human, as a result of our freedom, there's a certain autonomy to the created world that God needed in order for God to achieve full perfection. A creator who created a merely mechanical universe would be less perfect than a God who created a universe that culminates in free beings, right? That seems to be Schelling's argument, but nonetheless, there's something ungodly, something material, you could say, in the created world that God cannot control, that God has no power over, and that's evil. But this source of evil is also the source of the autonomy and freedom of human beings. And so, you can't have one without the other. This isn't really new with Schelling. This is a well understood, theological way of grappling with evil or a theodicy. But I think it's compellingly articulated in Schelling's essay, Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom. Okay, last thing on Schelling is this distinction between negative and positive philosophy. Schelling gets the last word over his friend Hegel, and Steiner doesn't mention this, but they were roommates at seminary as teenagers, although Schelling's 5 years younger than Hegel. Hegel kind of matured more slowly, only became well known when he published The Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807. He was already well into his late 30s, I think, whereas Schelling was famous by the time he was 21, maybe 19 even. He was publishing essays about Fichte's philosophy. So Schelling's star rose very quickly. He's very precocious. But he also outlives Hegel. And so he gets the last word. And in his late lectures in Berlin in the 1840s, he contrasts negative philosophy, which is this rational dialectic mode of abstract philosophy that seeks universal truth and is dialectical and through pure concepts can drive understanding again toward the universal, toward the general. And he contrasts this with positive philosophy, which rather than being rationalistic would be empirical, but a particular kind of empiricism that he calls metaphysical empiricism, which is not so much concerned with sensory experience of particular what's, but with the thatness of existence as such. And in this sense, many have read Schelling's late lectures as kind of proto-existentialist, focusing on existence as preceding essence, whereas negative philosophy would be all about the conceptual essences. Schelling makes a big deal about the transition in Hegel's logic to the philosophy of nature, that there's this gap where Hegel claims that the logic just reaches its completion and just spills over into nature. Schelling thinks that doesn't make any sense, and that we need positive philosophy to fill in that gap, to understand why God would create the universe at all. And this gets into a more, as Steiner says, theosophical and ultimately religious conception. And Schelling kind of ends up there late in his life. Steiner points out that it's kind of withdrawn from everyday life and accessible to individuals in their quiet moments of contemplation, but it becomes, Schelling's late work becomes less relevant to everyday people. In contrast, Steiner depicts Hegel as in love with life, with the everyday, with family and with politics, and is more outward focused and maybe extroverted in his philosophy than Schelling ends up being. There's this quick interlude with Schleiermacher, who you can probably tell Steiner doesn't think too highly of. He has deep religious feeling, but he thinks that Schelling articulates the core insight of Schleiermacher more clearly. So I'm not going to spend too much time on Schleiermacher. Hegel critiques, kind of almost lambasts, Schleiermacher's focus on religious feeling because it lacks any thought content, right? Hegel, Steiner says, lives completely in the element of thought. He sees sensing and feeling as but preparations for thinking. But there's this interesting line where Steiner says that Hegel leaps into the supersensible, right, by way of an abrupt termination of sensual content. And he says Steiner says this transition itself is thinking. And the way that Steiner characterizes this, I think, is what led me to share what I did earlier about the lack of an etheric form of perception, the inability of either Schelling or Hegel to sort of see through the sensory veil to these to cultivate a form of spiritual science whereby they could perceive etherically. There's a great little book. It was a dissertation by a 25-year-old, I think, Oxford theology student, Jonelle Schickler. I don't know if any of you, it's called Metaphysics as Christology, Odyssey of the Self from Kant and Hegel to Steiner. I can share a link with you all later. But Schickler argues that precisely what I'm saying, that Steiner completes this project begun by the German idealists by cultivating these new organs of perception that allow you to move beyond this limit of sensibility that Kant had erected. And though, again, Schelling and Hegel know that we can go beyond that veil, they don't themselves show us the way. One more to say about Hegel. Individuality. Hegel is described by some as the philosopher of restoration, because he's kind of the champion of the existing order. Steiner says he fought against indefinite ideals and thought of the state as not existing to serve individuals, but rather individuals exist to serve the state, and our freedom is found through such service to the state, right? I think this is in contrast to, Steiner's more anarchist orientation. But Hegel does redeem himself, a bit by championing the importance of individual freedom, and Steiner does admit this at the end, but I can sense this tension, which comes out more in the philosophy of freedom. There's a line where Steiner talks about Hegel preferring the general concept over the individual. But there's this intriguing line, and then I'll stop, where, as Steiner describes Hegel's way of thinking, for Hegel, thinking lifts the individual to the general, but leaves us isolated in that thinking, whereas action makes us a particular, right? Thinking lifts us to the general, but action makes us particular, but as a link in the community, right? And so there's this neat sort of inversion. Thinking lifts us to the general, but leaves us isolated. Acting makes us particular, but as a link in the historical community. So everything in Hegel is very dialectical in this sense. Everything contains its opposite. Everything's in contradiction, and contradiction becomes the motor that drives world history. So much more to say, but I want to hear from everybody else, so I'm going to shut up now. I hope.
Can I go? Can I go?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, John.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Matt. I love that. And I'm thinking about new organs of perception, to intuitive understanding, how Schelling and Goethe, they took us so far, but not far enough. And that veil of that sensory veil. I'm reminded of Eric Weiss. I think he was another teacher of yours. I remember listening to many of his lectures, but he talked about the transphysical senses, that we have the basic 5, and then we have the transphysical senses, which he says they're probably about 50 or 60. So I'm very attracted to that kind of on the other side of the veil. And also listening to Ashton and Matt's introduction on evil. I think you reference in that talk, an informal talk, I could hear you walking. I felt a sense of informality and wild philosophy happening. And you were both referencing 2 Steiner podcasts that you had heard, 2 Steinerian folks talking about their experience. And I listened to those podcasts and was, oh my God, this is the story of my life. Okay. And one of the persons talked about, she was already in the spiritual realms from a very early age. She also was traumatized. She was also gay. She was also became a theater worker, and she also fell in love with Shakespeare at a very early age, which is all of that is true of me. So I'm just sharing with you guys the nature of polyphasic communiques, okay? And in Steiner's writing, I went to the Steiner bookstore yesterday and had a dialogue with the lady who runs the store. She told me, she said, and I think he's a very polyphasic writer. The physical level, the ego, these are like waves, actually, rather than levels. The etheric, the astral, are built into every paragraph. He has a sentence that's from the ego or for the ego, the etheric, the astral, the physical. And this is more, she said, true of the next book we're thinking about reading, and probably this one. But taking that with me, I came home and I listened to Matt's recording of the chapter. And there's another person, the Steiner archive, who also reads hundreds of hours of Steiner. So I listened to both of your voices reading the same text. And it was a very different text for me. And because your voices, the two unique voices, the breath, the body, the larynx, the vibration, those are qualities. And I think that I'm going to shut up and listen to everybody else. I hope someday we maybe go to an hour and a half rather than an hour, because I'm sure everybody has something to say here, and I don't know that we're going to have time to even scratch the surface. But I had a dream last night. Oh, when I listened to those two voices, Matt and this other gentleman, what came to me was, this chapter is like what? And this is my response. It's like a Bruckner symphony. It's long, slow, cathedral of sound. It feels like I'm climbing a mountain. And I thought of the magic mountain. It's very Austrian alpine slopes. And then last night I had a dream. And this is where I'm actually trying to communicate from the veil that is already lifted, okay? And I think that's what Steiner was doing. So I have a dream. I'm in a room and there are people there, and I'm able to lift off of the floor and then float back down. And I have a strong kinesthetic sense of how I can lighten myself. So in the dream state, gravity is optional, okay? And I told the people in the room, I said, I can teach you how to do this. Then all of a sudden, I was looking at something and I wasn't sure if it was a mirror or a window, but there was an image that I was looking at, and it was a E.T., an iconic Whitley Strieber extraterrestrial. And I thought, uh-oh, I hope this is not a mirror, because I don't want to be an ET. But then all of a sudden, I realized it probably was more of a window, and I was looking at someone on the other side of the glass. The eye is the window, remember Eckhart? So here I am with this ET, and she identified her as female. She was trying to communicate to me, but her voice, her vocal apparatus is very different from mine. And I felt this, I knew I had to grow another organ to make this happen. And I felt very frustrated because I felt like I was totally inadequate to translate into human terms what was going on in this communique from the field of all possibilities. So I'm just sharing that with you because this is my very fragile attempt to move into a polyphasic rather than a monophasic enculturation, because we all are taught to be profoundly monophasic. So if we can move between these different states of consciousness and shape our communications with one another in a very deliberate way. Of course, it's going to be clumsy and awkward, but I think the benefits of it are going to be a re-education that we're going to have to do this ourselves. No one's going to do this for us. And I think that was something that Matt and Ashton brought forward, that if we're going to use these Zoom calls, we can't become algorithmic zombies staring passively into space. We have to actually bring forward from our own embodiment, from our own experience, certain things that we probably would prefer to keep private, okay? So thank you very much for your kind attention here. And I'm really looking forward to what's happening to everybody else as they read this magnificent book.
Thanks, John. I'm happy to stay an extra half hour today, just because I went a little bit long. in my presentation. So who else has thoughts they'd like to share? Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's just to respond to John and everything, really. I think it's wonderful what you're talking about, because it sort of expresses in a way to me, I think, what I'm getting a lot from this chapter, which is about the we heard the word imagination, and Fichte didn't quite have enough of that kind of that artistic sensibility. Kant would allow artistic sensibility, but he wouldn't allow it into science. And then Rudolf Steiner and Hegel, maybe, you know, his mind had a wonderful, like, plastic ability, continual sort of mobility and creativity, so he could follow that. But Rudolf Steiner perhaps exemplifying the ability to bring it down into the act. And so, you know, as you mentioned, John, even in say his writing creations, apparently there's an artistic kind of symphony going on in the construction of that. How more or less conscious, I'm not exactly sure, but I think what you're saying is kind of like your dream. For me, it really reminds me of this kind of the moment where we're at now, where it feels we have this kind of Hegelian state, you know, a perfect utopian state approaching as a possibility through our technology. But that's a kind of, at the moment, it's still a science, a technology that hasn't entered the artistic and imaginative space. It hasn't married them together. And, you know, I can imagine that angel or alien or whatever on the other side trying to communicate. So, you know, it can either come this way, more as a missing the human beings, like the Hegelian state is there for the state and the human beings for that, or come further on. And, you know, this is to Angus's question, that how do we develop these capabilities? And, you know, I don't think we need to sort of leap into visionary states, but something to do with the artistic sensibility. I'm just kind of I think that's what really came through the chapter for me, is that these fellows are philosophical fellows, but there's a further movement to be made.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you know, Hegel has this hierarchy where the sensuousness of art is overcome by the symbolism of religion, which itself is then overcome by the concepts of thinking, and that the concepts of thought are where the human and the divine achieves this kind of absolute knowing of itself. And I wonder if that's, I mean, in someone like Steiner, the importance of the arts, you know, gets elevated so much that it makes me feel like Hegel is a bit too top heavy, as it were. We don't want to just invert him as Marx did, but we need to better integrate these. Yeah.
Yeah, the sense I get is that coming back to that sense that it was mentioned in relation to Schelling, whereby as memories of the original creation, so the thoughts can be the memories of it, but can we actually then recreate, you know, through the original creation's impulse, create as the gods created? That's, you know, that's where the artistic thing comes in, because science checks what is and then basically gleans from that. So, you know, wasps made paper before we ever did, etc., etc. But can we bring something actually new, as, you know, the God or gods or whatever brought us?
What do you think, Angus? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, you're all talking, at least in my mind, to the question I asked in volley. One idea that's going in my mind as I'm listening to John and Jonathan and yourself talk is a conversation I had with somebody just a couple of days ago, and I had happened to read an article called "The Journine Question" from Fichte to Steiner. It was talking about the Lazarus problem and how, and I've linked to it so people can go and read it if they're interested. But one of the things that came out of this conversation is how what these philosophical terms help us to do is to reinterpret the same pictures we're looking at. You know, I talked about that's like the Copernican galactic centric system. We're trying to use these concepts to dig deeper into nature. But philosophy often as a dry, perceived at least as a dry subject. Is there another way of doing it that's like invites people, that's like with their emotional life into it at the same time? And I think the studying literature in that sense can be extremely rewarding. And I think what I've said in muddling terms here is like presented a lot more clearly in the article that I've just linked to. Yeah, so I don't know if that's like sets off any ideas with other people, but it's like literature as a means of literature stroke art as a means of helping people to directly experience how an additional concept, an additional worldview completely transforms the exact same sense impressions, and it leads us deeper into this thinking. I saw one person nodding. Thanks, Lorenzo.
No, well said, Angus. Go ahead, Lorenzo, and then I see Teresa and Matt.
Yeah, I was thinking about Jonathan's point about Steiner using art as an analog to God creation. I mean, Steiner talking about Schelling, about the creative act as an analog to the world creation by God, and I wanted to relate something that Steiner writes, that God would be imperfect if he wasn't able to create somebody as free as he is, to a problem which is very actual nowadays in physics, in information theory, and science in general. It is how to define knowledge as opposed to information. I mean, as a special kind of information. And there are many theories, but one interesting definition that has been recently proposed is that that kind of information that can lead a subject in the world to the means that make him or her able to reproduce himself, that is to create a perfect replica of himself, is what distinguishes knowledge from information. And this is a way, you know, to solve the hard epistemological problem. It's like saying, if whatever, however illusory is your reading of the facts that you're living, if in that context you are able to create something that has exactly the same position that you have gained a real knowledge about the ambient. And this, I think, mirrors in some way what was being thought of about God and on a theosophical level by Schelling, and is still very, very actual.
thoughts about that, but I'm gonna share them momentarily. I'll let Teresa and Matt go first. Go ahead, Teresa. I think you're still muted, Teresa.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Matt. Yes, so I think you Matt may have mentioned seeing through the sensory veil, and how we as humans can explore spiritual science. So that made me think of the 12 senses, Rudolf Steiner's 12 senses, and I wonder whether he had fine-tuned those 12 senses that he discussed. One, I'm not sure if how many of you know the 12 senses, but I'm very deeply interested in his discussions of the 12 senses in order to explore nature's wisdom. And so I'm interested to know how many of you know about Rudolf Steiner's 12 senses. Yeah. And I'm thinking that would help, fine-tuning those 12 senses would help humanity penetrate the sensory veil. And I'll just leave that there and just leave that up for discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. We can circle back to that. I think certainly a more adequate phenomenology of human experience than the standard empiricist account. Go ahead, Matt.
Great, thanks. Kind of back to the when we were talking about art and creativity and stuff like that. I know something that I've thought for a few years is how something akin to aesthetics could be used as almost like a meta philosophy, a philosophy for almost organizing all the other philosophies, both across the disciplines, but also for individuals. And you'd be using it. I don't really like the word aesthetics the way it's used anyway. I think it's too limited, but I guess what I mean by meta philosophy, a way to organize them in people's lives. And so you get to decide how much of all these different philosophies you want to bring on board and use. And then you can actually get creative with it, because then you can actually start to create your own names for what you are as a philosopher, and the things that you believe that are these hybrids and all these different things like that. And then you go from there to do other creative endeavors with it. But it's an idea that I haven't really fleshed out very strongly, obviously, but the conversation made me think of it. Thank you.
Yeah, there's so much here to pick up on. I'm still thinking about what you shared, Lorenzo, and it reminds me of a comment that Kant makes, which I think is in posthumously published work, where he was really revisiting his entire transcendental conception of philosophy and moving towards, as a result of reading Schelling, a more participatory way of engaging with nature and what knowledge of nature amounts to. And he's exploring actually some kind of ether theory in this late text. It's published as Opus Posthumum. Actually, Eckhart Forster's the editor of that, in the English translation at least, so the same author as the 25 Years of Philosophy I mentioned earlier. But in this text, Kant says, I think this is an exact quote, "To know the world, one must first manufacture it in his own self." And, that's superficially quite similar to what Schelling is saying, that to philosophize about nature means to create nature. But I think it's at least if Kant meant that in the sense of his transcendental philosophy, where one constructs the world out of the categories of the understanding, I think it's quite different than what Schelling is doing, in a way, embodying the productivity of nature, natura naturans, in his own imagination. It's not clear to me that Kant was quite claiming to be doing the same thing. Manufacture, again, I don't know the original German in this case, but it's quite different than creation. So in any event, it struck me that often materialists and mechanistic thinkers nowadays will say, I only understand it if I can create one myself, produce one myself, like a machine version of it, right? Which I think is a rather degraded conception of knowledge, that's not participatory at all, and that's more about control. So yeah, what are those thoughts? How do you hear what I'm saying? How does that reflect what you were commenting on earlier?
Yeah, just the very last words you said were very meaningful to me, because I was thinking about the very thought of I can understand only what I can create a mechanical model of, is maybe Hooke, no, Kelvin, I think, Lord Kelvin. Anyway, the science, this mentality, this very sentence has been used, I think, for control. As you said, is something that interests power, as opposed to emancipation. And you can see it in initiatory circles and groups that deal with magic, where there is, they call it illuminism, even if it's a different kind of illuminism, where you have a ritual that is shaped out of an existing technology, but the relationship between the technology and the ritual is not evident, but is only progressively revealed. And when at the end you are revealed that the ritual was built on with the same structure of an existing technology, you have to believe it, because in the world we live today, you cannot not believe in the telephone or in the fridge. That technology is the ultimate source for the self-limiting beliefs that we have, and the fact that the world seems to stand by its own, and our participation in creating it is so obscured, is partly due, in my opinion, to our unconscious, very strong belief to all sorts of mechanical models that are the things that our belief is attracted to, like black holes for belief, for our modern type of humans. Yeah.
This is so important, but I'll put a pin on it and see what Angus has to think. But I want to circle back to what we're getting into here. Go ahead, Angus.
Go ahead with your thought, Matt, because it is directly related. Mine is vaguely related, but it's like, I think it helps the flow of the conversation if you keep with the thread.
Okay, well, I'll just briefly say that, one of the ways I've distinguished Fichte and Schelling is to see how, in so many ways, Fichte's way of thought implicitly, if not explicitly, has kind of won out, in the sense that nature has been reduced to a kind of a stage for the realization of human freedom. And so everything is there for us to utilize in service of our own freedom. I think Fichte's view is more profound than this, but in effect, the human ego has been placed at the center of everything, and the earth is just the raw material for us to mechanically re-engineer to serve a shallow conception of freedom, no doubt, but nonetheless to serve our sense of liberal bourgeois freedom, perhaps. Whereas, Schelling was trying to point out that no, nature has, the cosmos has an autonomy. It has a spirit. It has a spiritual interior, and we can participate in that. And indeed, we are that come to consciousness, and that we can't simply, a mechanical philosophy misleads us by taking for granted that the human is severed from nature and that nature exists only out there for us to manipulate. And it's a very dangerous path that we've gone down, which I think is more Fichtean than Schellingian. Though again, this I know I don't mean the caricature of Fichte's view, but I think in so many ways it has won out. So that's just the thought I wanted to share.
I agree.
Okay, I'll circle back to a comment about Kant's categories there, because Kant, people who are more who have more philosophical training than me, so please correct me if I say anything that's incorrect here. But my understanding is Kant was sort of like, well, how do we come up with these categories? So there's a random nature about them. There should be something more substantial, determining how we arrive at what these categories are. And if I have to pick out the biggest diamond for me in this chapter 7, it's when Hegel's talking about the motor of the evolution of thought. This word contradiction, Widerspruch, that he uses in there, and it's somehow so illuminating this idea that everything that we are served up with, we assess it with our thinking capacity, but it's always missing something, and there's this contradiction there. And then the synthesis antithesis, and the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That nature itself leads us forward. It's because we automatically recognize the limits of our thinking when we think about something, and that moves us onwards and upwards in our thinking. And it was more a question for me of sharing that thought of this was one of those wow moments reading this chapter, contradiction, and the essential nature of it in moving forward, or opposition, you could also describe it as.
Contradiction or negation is where Hegel's brilliance, I think, really shines. In terms of the Kantian category, I mean, so much that Hegel gets credit for. He's the most widely read of the German idealists, but so much of what he's often given credit for was actually at least discovered and perhaps not articulated as fully as he did. But for example, the Kantian categories being sort of just delivered on a platter in Kant's critique, Fichte takes that and says, oh, wait a minute, we have to show how these are genetically derived from acts of thinking. And in Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre in the 1794 version, the first version that he's teaching to students at Jena, he tries to show this through positing of free thinking activity. All 12 of these categories can be generated, and space and time, the forms of intuition, just as a result of this thesis, antithesis, synthesis dialectic, again, that Hegel's often credited with And he does elaborate it brilliantly in ways that Fichte doesn't, and his presentation in the phenomenology is just stunningly brilliant. But nonetheless, I think Fichte really planted the seed and at least helped sprout it, and then Hegel planted it and gave birth to a forest, as it were. But yeah, the motor of contradiction, not only for logic but for history, I think, so illuminating and deep. And it's shocking that relatively few philosophers and political thinkers grasp this. It's some Marxists do, but I think they take it in the exact wrong direction. I wish more people could grok this. It might help some of our political discord. Who else? Feel free to take us in an entirely different direction if you have thoughts. And if you do have to leave, I know we scheduled an hour. Please don't feel like you need to stay, but I'm going to hang out for another half hour. Teresa, go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. One section of chapter 7 that stood out for me on my version of the book on page 160, the Greek, if I may quickly read it, the Greek civilization stands on this ground. It was the age in which man lived in harmony with nature, or as Schiller expresses it in his essay on naive and sentimental poetry, man himself was nature and therefore did not seek nature. And for me, it was, it just pulled my interest on how did this Greek civilization be in that state, and then it drew me back to ponder on those 12 senses and see if they were at all connected. So that's I'll leave that there.
Yeah, I'll have to contemplate that.
I have to leave very shortly, but I can leave you with a question that I was thinking about. That is this characteristic of Schelling we talked about, that he says that existence comes before even God. The ungodly is his kind also of justification for the existence of evil. This characteristic of today, we could say that the real, what a Lacanian would call the real, doesn't it go together with what we were talking about, the difference between Hegel and Steiner about individuality? I mean, isn't it that giving precedence to the individual over the state goes together with giving precedence to the ungodly to the godly? I mean, the giving precedence to the real as something which has no shape, which is ultimately unknowable, as against light, rationality, is individuality against commonality, linked to this duality, in your opinion? I mean, everybody's, of course.
Yeah, I think that's, sorry, I can't find the raise the hand thing on my thing here, but I think that's very stimulating idea. And it seems to sort of speak to a lot of what I find in this chapter, with this kind of back and forward between two things. And, we just heard that characterized as this kind of motor that's always driving us on and on and on. And so it begs the question, is that always going to be the case? You know, can there be a reconciliation between the godly and the ungodly? Can we come to a point where we're not just impelled and continuously driven on?
Yeah, I think that's what Lorenzo is suggesting. That's insightful. I mean, in Platonic terms, we'd call it the receptacle or the chora that was there already when the creator generated a cosmos, and that the cosmos is in some sense. Oh, did we lose Lorenzo? Oh, he had to leave. Well, oh well. I'll see the recording. That in some sense, this formlessness is also the source of our freedom, because it's independent from the divine, and it's the source both of good and of evil, and of a kind of love that is free love, that the creator, the creator's perfection is enhanced by the creation of a cosmos and of an anthropos that can love freely as a free choice rather than just out of necessity. And in relation to this political question of the individual and the state, it's not as I think it's related. It's not as simple as saying, you know, Steiner wants to uphold the individual and that the state should serve the individual, because I think, you know, Steiner very much does respect the genius of Hegel's account of individuality itself and self-consciousness through the dialectic of recognition, or the struggle for recognition, like in the master-slave dialectic. It's one of the most brilliant parts of the phenomenology of spirit, and I think it helpfully challenges and it challenges the liberal conception of a state of nature and a social contract by which seemingly already existing individuals would overcome the state of nature and agree to certain laws in the context of a state. Hegel shows just how naive that is. I mean, it's this conception, the social contract theory presupposes sort of adult, rational individuals just sort of hanging out, coming to the table to sign a contract. And Hegel wants to show, well, where did that individual self-consciousness come from in the first place? So I think it's a more historically concrete account. And if you're not familiar with the master-slave dialectic, I have a video summarizing it. There's lots of summaries of this, but I think what Steiner ultimately is not trying to say, make us choose between a simple binary, you know, either the state exists to serve the individual or the individual exists to serve the state. His conception of social threefolding is obviously more, it's richer than that. But nonetheless, he finds something lacking in Hegel's conception of the state, in that it doesn't afford individuals the type of freedom that he sought to defend in them. I think did I see your hand waving, Angus?
No, but it can wave if you like. I was whilst you were saying that, I was looking at one of these wonderfully provocative statements that Steiner makes here. It's like when he's commenting, it's like it's the end of it's actually when he's talking about Schleiermacher. Yeah, it is. Yeah. He makes this comment: for until the discovery of idealism, the real concept of freedom was lacking in all systems, in that of Leibniz as well as Spinoza. And I think that also speaks to this problem of state and free individual. If all of our world conception is built around it's like practicalities and sort of like fixing machines and doing these manual things, then all of those processes, all of those material processes are governed by determined laws. And if we only live in that world, there is no freedom in it. And this part in chapter 7 where he highlights that how idealism is essential for a refined concept of what freedom is really remarkably profound, because once it is in the realm of ideas that we can begin to free ourselves from the shackles of materialism. We're not discounting the value that materialism can add to the world. Very well. Okay, according to Hegel, of course, it's like it's God's creation and it's there to like help us, lead us up to like Jacob's ladder type of thing. But how essential this thrust of philosophical thought is, that's like that wakes up in Germany at the end of the 30 Years' War and carries on through to the 1800s. It's really a remarkable period in philosophical history.
Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's there's something about the German language, because they have the word Geist, which in English we separate into mind and spirit, and for them it's the same. And so this could only really happen in a place with that language. And I think this is, maybe one of the things we're struggling with in the world today, that Germany has been so crushed that, back from the 30 Years' War on, the developments in there have not got out in the manner which they can't. And instead, the sort of Anglo-Saxon mind and spirit as separate things has been the sort of, it's the lingua franca, the world language now. So yeah, that came up to me again in this chapter, that this could happen in a time and place. So there's a reason why Rudolf Steiner was born where he was, I guess, because to have that facility, we're asking, how do we get this facility? And I think that in the German language, there's already a closer affinity to the direction we're trying to head, simply because of that one word that we divide.
Thank you. Can I chime in?
Sure.
I really appreciate your remarks on Hegel. I confess I have a Hegel phobia, brought on by the fact that I knew a lot of Hegelians in my 20s who were from Germany, and they were going to the School of Social Research here in New York. So I heard a lot about Hegel, but they were also Marxists, and they were very materialist Marxists. Most Marxists are, but so actually my complaint isn't with Hegel probably, but with the Marxists who use Hegel in certain ways that, really distorted my feeling for Hegel. But I do appreciate, Matt, that you're bringing forward the master-slave dynamic, because I think that's quite brilliant and has been very useful in my own trying to deconstruct the inner critic and the slave part of my nature and the master part of my nature, and how I see this played out in so many dramas around me. And I'm thinking now about my thinking, because I'm reading Steiner, and Steiner's all about thinking in this text. I'm just quoting about from someone some of us have read, Armine, Frederick Armine, The Perennial Alternative. I got this book at the Steiner bookshop yesterday. I couldn't find Riddles of Philosophy. It was the only one they didn't have, which is the one I wanted. But I found this by Armine, and I think it's relevant to the thread that's developing here. He says, thinking can be objective. Objects become objects only through the process of human thinking. The appropriate distinction is between kinds of thinking, analytic versus synthetic. And then he brings up the term Verstand. It's a German word. Verstand, or intellect, can only clarify the contours of concepts that have already arrived, whereas Vernunft, I'm bad German here, can follow the creation of concepts in their process of becoming. So in a way, it's like Bortov said, Kant And the neo-Kantians are basically studying what has already arrived rather than what's upstream that hasn't taken form yet, which is in the process of becoming. So once again, I'm drawn to my musical metaphor. Music is not the tones, nor even the sum of the individual tones, but something that emerges between the tones, that in a paradoxical way is already there. And I think this musical metaphor is very biological. I mean, there's something about our bodies that know that we're not computers, we're music. You know? And I want to, this is a little aside directed towards Matt, and an interview that I really, really enjoyed with Bernardo Kastrup about a year ago. And I'm thinking about Hegel and the master-slave dynamic, and all the philosophers that have been mentioned here, and the nature of their fluid thinking and idealism. And Bernardo Kastrup identifies himself as an analytic idealist. And I was wondering, in your interview with him, well, it wasn't really an interview, it was more of a dialogue that was hosted by somebody else, who was moderated by someone else. But I was wondering if there's something you know now that you didn't know before that dialogue with Bernardo. And I'm asking that because I know that it seemed there were the fuzzy area between the two of you seemed to be about emergence and weak and strong forms of emergence. That's what my memory, that's what I'm remembering. Anyway, if there's anything there, Matt, that could be useful for this conversation, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, we could definitely move on. I'm sure there are lots of people with lots of other questions besides this. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, there's several things there that I'll briefly pick up on, and then I want to invite anyone who hasn't shared if you'd like to chime in. Well, on Bernardo Kastrup and his analytic idealism, is there anything I have realized since then or through that conversation? I'm not sure. I think my problem with his form of idealism, which is not at all influenced by the German idealists who he claims not to understand, just as he doesn't understand Whitehead. My problem with his form of idealism is that it basically makes the world of our everyday experience a complete illusion. And while we've been talking about, the shadows on Plato's cave wall and the need to see through the sensory veil, I think this, in a anthroposophical sense, is not to say that the sensory world is an illusion. It's just that we need to see it rightly, see through it, rather than just sort of erase it to get to this ultimate truth for Bernardo, which would be the one mind at large, that's totally undifferentiated. It sounds a bit like Hegel's caricature of Schelling's view in the Phenomenology of Spirit, if you're familiar, where Hegel he says to Schelling later in a letter, I was talking about the lesser lights among your followers, not about you, but he says that this conception of the absolute as a night in which all cows are black, in other words, there's no differentiation, and it's sort of just this mystical unity, and there's no thought content there, no differentiation. Bernardo's conception of the mind at large seems a bit like that. But overall, I'm glad that someone challenging materialism is gaining some popularity, and it's certainly an improvement on the more dominant mode of thought, or unthought, as it were, of materialism. But in terms of Marx, speaking of materialism, I just wanted to briefly say that I think what's dangerous, I think, about Marxism is the collapsing of the three spheres of society into the state in a Hegelian way. Even though Marx is a materialist and Hegel's an idealist, they seem to share this sense that the individual exists to serve the state, and that the state is given the role of regulating not only the economy but the culture as well, and education, and even if Marx ideally would hope that the state eventually would no longer be necessary, it's like the devil's in the details. How do you get there, right? And the ends end up justifying the means, at least as historically when attempts have been made at this. Whereas, we need to differentiate the cultural and the economic from the political. And the political, even in a country like the United States, that has this tradition of federalism and states' rights and an attempt to distribute power more locally. There's very much still a reliance on the government to solve our problems, and the government, the Federal Reserve Bank, to make the economic machine function correctly in this top-down way, and all of this. And we have a very shallow conception of freedom. Progressives want the government to fix our cultural problems. That's not the government's role. And conservatives also want the government to fix cultural problems now. And it's like everyone's very confused, and it's a very dangerous situation of two extremes fighting for control over a very powerful federal government. It's terrifying me. And I think,
right, especially when we have Russia seems to be melting down right now. And this is very, very problematic for geopolitics. And China and Iran are all watching this, right? So, and taking notes. And so I think we're in this strange transition. And if I was looking at it as a Steinerian, I'm not saying this is definitely a partial view. Putin is the ultimate Mephistopheles. We thought free trade was going to solve all of our problems. And I wonder about how Germany feels about free trade now with someone that they knew was a ruthless dictator. I think we're in the midst of this crunch. So I do find the Steinerian sort of Mephistopheles, the Ahriman, and the Luciferic and the Christ as the third, which can contain both of those polarities. If there is a strong enough third in each individual, then this just becomes Gestalt parts work. And we can, if we've done that work with ourselves, do it within the systems that we are members of.
Right.
Hopefully, family, clan, location, but you have to be in close proximity. I don't know if you can go to the UN and make a statement and it matter very much, because I think it's the confusion between the macro and the micro levels that I think we're trying to sort out right now.
Yeah, and the importance of the shift to a Trinitarian way of thinking to get beyond the dualisms,
right?
So important. And I think as we get to the latter half of this book, more to the present time, Steiner would have been writing in the second half, in the midst of, either right before or in the midst of the First World War. And I think
so, yeah.
I want to encourage us to apply this to the social and political situation of the day, because ultimately I think that's what Steiner wanted us to do, not just to think about this philosophically and spiritually, but apply it. I want to say something more about the senses, particularly the sense of warmth, but I'll wait. I want to give others a chance. Jeff, your hand went up first, I think. Jeff Corentere, you're still muted. There you go.
Was muted there, but there we are. I just want to tie some of the threads today and put an anchor back into my world. It's all related, but I forget who it was today was saying about the unique capacity of a given language, the German language, and that gave Steiner a certain ability in what he was working on, and all these thinkers were really looking at. There's a general truth to that, that each language has its own spirit, or whatever you want to call it, its own uniqueness. It's not, there are no synonyms, and translation is a bitch in that sense. My whole point of all of that is, if the big theme of the whole book and this chapter, and these developing capacities of human consciousness, and now we're talking specifically about the German language. To bring that into my world, as I said, is in Dr. Hahnemann, his system of Heilkunstmedizin. He was very much like Goethe, like he had this deep philosophy, but he didn't really articulate it in an extensive way. You kind of have to reverse engineer it. And part of his medical diagnosis is comes to down to the German term das Gefühl. Sorry, my pronunciation, the feeling, like this idea of, this is a very German language capacity for objective feeling, right? In English, we're very familiar with subjective feelings, we have them all day long, but this capacity for objective feeling really became the cornerstone for Hahnemann's medical diagnosis. He talked about the feeling, das Gefühl, of a patient in terms of how that disease impregnated their whole being. And diagnosing on that basis really gives you a truly objective diagnosis, as opposed to all the, what we tend to have been blinded by in terms of modern empirical medical diagnosis and false labels, and you have arthritis and this and that. That's a whole lot of falsehood built into that kind of diagnosis. But anyways, I just wanted to tie back whoever made that comment about Steiner and all these thinkers in the German language. It definitely has a big root back in my world as well.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Objective feeling reminds me, I have to say, so much of Whitehead's notion of prehension, where there's a vector feeling, he calls it, coming in from the environment that we absorb, and it only becomes subjective secondarily as we receive it and interpret it. But originally, it's an objective feeling. Anyways, that's an aside. Alex, I think you're next.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to shortly give a bit of my impressions of this chapter. I enjoyed reading. I have no detailed knowledge of this, the philosophies being spoken about, but I had a feeling that Schelling I enjoyed reading about Schelling. I had a feeling that he had this capacity of solving paradoxes or contradictions in a way that reminded me of the artistic sensibility of William Blake, for example, of the universals and the particulars coming together in a very nice way. And also it reminds me a little bit of the sense that I get from Steiner, that thinking and or worldviews, the worldview becomes round. In opposite, maybe, and here it's also my impression that other philosophers tend to be more linear. They tend to go towards a pinnacle in a way, or a very specific aspect that is, I don't know, it feels less round. They try to find something that is more of a higher value than other aspects. So Schelling gave me that impression of being able to solve paradoxes. And I think that's, for me, that's important going forward, even when we speak about conflicts in our time, and also the paradoxes that Lorenzo brought up, how to live in community and be an individual. I don't know if that's, I feel it's difficult to find sort of a definite answer to these polarities, and it's always a mystery and an unknown to live there. Also, Coleridge comes to mind, and his idea of negative capability. So finding that space for me feels important.
I think it's Keats, right? Negative capability.
Maybe you're right. Yeah.
We mustn't forget about Eliot. I think you call it the objective correlative. So that's similar to what I think someone was talking about, objective feeling. There's objective thinking, there's objective feeling. Of course, we can't separate feeling from thinking. We know that now. But I'm reminded of a great actor, Laurence Olivier, who's playing Oedipus, right? Great tragic role of all time. And he has a moment when it is revealed that he has married his mother and has given birth to, out of this incestuous union, children, his history, and that he's murdered his father. That's a really big thing to take in, right? And what Olivier did was he like went down into his guts and he started making these sounds. And it evidently, from people who were there, they report is when it was everyone screamed and almost jumped out of their seats and ran for the exit. And I think there's something objective about that. He had a sound. He said, what was the big, how did you make that? How did that happen? And he said, oh, it wasn't about a deep feeling or anything, although there was feeling there, but what he was working on was what vowel sound does he prolong for a certain duration to get under everybody's skin. And he said it was an E sound. It was doing, and everyone went bonkers. So I think there is something objective in our feeling. We can look at a person without any words, and we can say if we can feel they're sad or happy or gotten bad news or they have a stomach ache. You know, this is how we survived, how our mothers were able to sort of figure out what's going on before we had speech. So I'm just sharing that with you guys because I think that's very stimulating, and also a part of that polyphasic communique from the field of all possibilities is happening all the time. We're just, or we wouldn't be alive. We just don't pay attention to it. I think that if we start to develop a semiotic sensitivity, this is Lorenzo bringing up the study of Charles Saunders Peirce about that triadic structure, which unfortunately most of the triads we're in slip and slide all over the place. So we get this funny feeling of us versus them constantly. But if you had a solid, if you had a triad that was versatile, it could hold these polarities without, burning down the house, which is what's happening now. And so many of our institutions, which are rigidly held hierarchies, rather than the heterarchy. Heterarchies are not hierarchies. Heterarchies have it's a structure, but everyone gets to play different parts within that structure. So everyone gets to play first, everyone gets to play second, everyone gets to play third. And that's very different, I think, from the rigid hierarchies that our institutions are selling us.
Yeah. Well, we should close. I wanted to just leave us with one final thought, if I may, quickly, that Alex reminded me of. You mentioned Coleridge, who was a translator and an inheritor of Schelling's thought, really the first to bring Schelling into English, often through plagiarism, but Schelling did forgive him later because he so appreciated being understood by someone in the English-speaking world. Schelling had this term that he used to describe the bringing together of opposites, as you were saying, Alex, and as you followed up on John. That's a reworking of the German term for imagination or power of imagination, Einbildungskraft. Schelling's neologism is in Einsbildung, which would be the sort of building together of or weaving together of opposites. And Schelling, Coleridge rather, translates this as esemplastic in English. And I wanted to connect this briefly as a closing thought to one of the 12 senses that Teresa was throwing into the mix, which we didn't really get to follow up on, but there's a sense of warmth, which to my mind is related to our capacity, as Schelling was so proficient at, to imagine the interiority of nature. We think of temperature now in this super abstract mechanical way, and Steiner invites us to connect with warmth as the true nature of the materiality, I would say, and it goes back to the Saturn phase of evolution. And if we can think and imagine and perceive the natural world through this sense of warmth, I feel like that gets us closer to its concrete spiritual nature, rather than allowing the mechanical model of temperature as just violently agitated molecules to cloud our ability to perceive warmth as it arises in our experience directly. So I invite us to contemplate that over the next week. And next week I have a conflict at our normal time, podcast on Teilhard de Chardin that I'm going to participate in. And so throwing it out there, would you all be able to meet at 9 a.m. Pacific next Thursday? Does that raise any tremendous conflicts?
I can't. I have a meeting with job.
Oh,
Yeah. But y'all could do it without me.
We always have the video. You could
You just tune into the recording.
is that okay?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
Seems like
Okay,
it.
so we'll do. Thanks for your willingness, Ashton, to let us do that.
that would be great. Matt, can I ask a really clumsy question about logistics here? Because
Mhm.
Where do you post things? Is it on Earth Phenomenon?
I posted
noticed-
there. It's on
but you-
YouTube.
But you didn't. I think you didn't upload chapter 6, so I
I
didn't
did
know where.
yesterday.
Oh, you did yesterday. Okay, so I can post any remarks that I might have had there.
There,
And
sure.
I had trouble with volley. It wasn't working for me, but maybe I'll be able to figure that out, because a lot of my comments I could probably condense the way Cameron has. I've been following you on volley, so
Yeah.
I'm hoping to bring that in as a very useful tool,
Yeah.
so that when we get together in these larger groups, we already have a head start. So
Mhm.
thanks.
Yep. Wonderful. All right, everyone. I'll send out the Zoom link via email for 9 a.m. Pacific next Thursday, and I'll send the recording out as well. Great conversation today. See you next week.